Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm chatting with Allison Zinder, gastronomy guide, certified chef, and culinary educator. She's here to explore a word that somehow encompasses cuisine, fine dining, and a certain culinary theater so essential to the French restaurant experience. Gastronomique. Welcome, Allison. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I'm really excited to talk about my favorite subject.
I am super excited to talk about your favorite subject, which is a subject that we both love, which is food. Before we get started, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and sort of what brought you here to France and what you're doing here these days?
Yes. Well, I originally came to France in 1995. I was really interested in food. Obsessed by food. And I already spoke French when I finished college. So right away, that just dates me there. I had done a first sort of apprenticeship in a kitchen in Virginia, where I was living. And when I finished school, I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to go to France. I'm just going to move to Paris and see what happens. So that happened. And of course, I just immediately started spending a lot of time around food and cooking. And I eventually went to cooking school and cooked in all different kinds of kitchens in the Loire Valley, including a gastronomic restaurant, which we're going to talk about what that actually means, and even like a truck stop. I just did sort of a whole sort of panoply of different restaurant experiences as a chef. So that was fun and really hard work. And then I started teaching cooking in the apprentice system, the French apprentice system. And nowadays I have my own business as a gastronomy guide. So I like to take travelers on food tours, food history tours. I also run 2 study abroad programs, which are, of course, on slight hiatus because COVID. And my newest role is as head of academics at a restaurant and hotel management school in the 8th district in Paris. So that's a new and exciting challenge.
Amazing. So you've got your fingers in sort of all pots of this this concept that we're going to be chatting about today, which is this French word gastronomique, which is often translated as gastronomic, but I feel like that doesn't actually evoke that much to an American or Anglophone person. We see, well, you talked about this, so let's get the ball rolling with this idea of a gastronomic restaurant. We see restaurant gastronomique in France all the time, but what is a gastronomic restaurant? What does that mean?
Well, I actually wanted to sort of start out with the idea of what the word gastronomy actually means.
Yeah.
But I will say that gastronomic restaurant, we don't tend to use that word in English. We tend to say fine dining restaurant, and I have spent a lot of time sort of thinking about and explaining to my hospitality students the difference between fine dining restaurants, for example, in the United States, where I'm from, and restaurant gastronomique, which is so much more involved and codified. And anyway, so we're going to talk about the specific type of restaurant. But I do, there are a lot of different definitions of sort of gastronomy and gastronomic. Gastronomic. Sorry, I never use that word. I use gastronomy or gastronomique in French. So the first time we saw that word sort of gastronomie was, I guess, in 1801, something like that. The word actually comes from 2 different words, gastro, which of course is, your stomach basically, and nomos, which has to do with like either a rule or a law or a custom. Now, here's where we get into all sorts of interpretations of what the word gastronomique means, because you've got, well, wait, what does this mean? You've got customs of the stomach, laws of the stomach. My stomach has laws. What does this mean?
Your stomach has laws if it's a French stomach, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, it definitely does. Lots of laws around how to consume food, how to prepare food, how to set your table. There's so much involved in that one word. One of the definitions that you're going to find, for example, in French of the word gastronomy or gastronomique would be art de la bonne chère. So then you're like, what is bonne chère? What does that mean? And actually, bonne chère really means it's the idea of welcoming. someone. It's kind of the root idea of hospitality, which is how do you welcome someone, whether you're being welcomed into a restaurant, you're welcoming someone into your home, you're going to be involved in all different kinds of activities, not just, for example, what you're going to serve to people or what you're going to be served in a restaurant, what's in your plate. There's all the other things around that, the types of wine you're going to serve, what is actually in your plate, of course, the types of glasses that you're going to serve the wine in, the order of the different parts of the meal, all of the different courses of the meal, whether it's, 2, 3, 4, 10, whichever direction you want to go, whether you're receiving someone at your home or you're eating in a restaurant here in France, it's going to be it's an entire system, a universe of precepts, of maybe not laws, but definitely customs, traditions around the table. It's very all encompassing, this idea of gastronomical and gastronomy and gastronomic. It's pretty amazing.
That sort of reminds me, when the French protected the French gastronomic meal with the UNESCO list of intangible world heritage. That was what we were talking about. It's not just the food; it's all of those elements that you just highlighted. It's the order of the dishes. It's this fact that it has to be in I think that there was a stipulation that it had to be served in a convivial space. It's so much more than just the food.
Exactly. Actually, I loved your definition of it for your Whetstone article. It was very much because you mentioned the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage. It's a festive repast enjoyed around a beautiful table and boasting a fixed structure: aperitif, starter, main, cheese, dessert, and digestif. And it's highly systemized. And I think that's a really important element of it. It also involves the people's behavior at the table, which, in a very sort of limited way, we could call that table manners, but it's more about table manners. It's so much more than just, where you're holding your hands or the way you're holding your fork. And when we talk about it, it seems extremely rigid and fixed, but in the end, when you go to what we consider to be a gastronomic restaurant in France, people, I think, will find that in a lot of ways it's a very forgiving structure. It's not as rigid as it seems. But there's a lot more to say about that specific idea and the restaurant, and we'll get to that. Because there's another definition of gastronomy, which, if you sort of search for the word in English, it's all about food and culture together, which I think really sort of goes to the heart of that word. Because when you're talking about customs, what you really are talking about is, when we go back to that word nomos, which is rules or laws, and also customs, which are, customs that have become sort of rules around the table, rules about how to set the table, how to choose the ingredients that are going into your dishes, how to prepare those ingredients. All of those are customs now. And I guess, customs maybe that have come over into law, but I don't really like the word law because it sounds really, really strict. If you talk to any French chef, and this happens all the time in the kitchen, you get into a new kitchen, when you're starting out a new chef's position, and you have a certain way of doing things. For example, you have a certain way of cooking green beans, and the head chef who you're working for is going to say, oh no, in this kitchen, the way we cook green beans is this way. And every single chef is going to tell you a slightly different way of the right way of how to cook green beans, because every chef's way is the right way, of course. They say in French, le chef a toujours raison. The chef is always right. Even when the chef is wrong, the chef is right. So it's going to, vary from kitchen to kitchen about what the right thing is, just as the right, quote unquote, right way to set your table is going to vary depending on the type of restaurant you're eating in, depending on this person's home where you're eating. It's just, it's variable. So law is a little bit of a harsh word, I think, but it's more about custom, I think.
But that story you were telling me about the green beans and the chef always being right. So I also, like you, give a lot of food tours here in Paris, and we'll put links to both of our tours in the description. So if anybody wants to come along and hear more about culinary law, they can do that. But I think one thing that I often tell my visitors, and usually, a little bit tongue in cheek, is that the French really do like to have rules about their food. And I often tell people that the French don't like to decide what they like. They like other people to tell them what they should like so that they can disagree with them. But I do think, see, you're laughing because it's a little bit true.
It's more than a little bit true, Emily. I totally agree with you.
But I think that, this instinct we have in the States for the customer to always be right, we see that sort of turned on its head in France, and maybe it's not quite as bad as Emily in Paris painted it to be when, the chef refuses to cook her steak the way that she wants it. But there is sort of this, you're right, law is too much, but there is this idea of, I am the expert and I know better than you, so just do it this way.
Yes.
Do you think that that's more French than it is, like, let's say, I don't know, Italian or Japanese? Like, are the French more prone to this kind of like systemization or normalization of their gastronomy, of their cuisine than other cultures, do you think?
Yes, I do think so. I feel like, well, I'm not as familiar with as many different cultures and their traditions around the table and, local cuisines and their customs of preparing different foods. But I do feel like there's maybe a more forgiving nature. In the United States, we do have that rule that the customer is always right. And I pretty much unequivocally can say that in France, the customer is always wrong. And I don't mean to say that the customers really are always wrong, but it's true that there is this very systematic way of doing things. I've worked in many kitchens where the head chef would sort of say, grumble about a customer, a client who had sent his or her request into the kitchen saying, well, but can you substitute this? Because I don't like lentils or whatever. And the chef, who either just grumbles and does what he's supposed to do to make the client happy, or, as more often the case is than not in France, the chef will start to actually yell and say, if she doesn't like lentils, what is she doing in a restaurant? She should just stay home and blah, 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 just really. And then sometimes we'll actually send the dish out with the lentils on it, but put the thing, the other elements of the plate sort of on the side. So at least that the lentils are still there. It's like proving a point, like I'm right, you're wrong. And it can be frustrating. But I think you'll find also in France that I never go to dinner with French people who are going to say, well, I don't like parsley. Can you not put the parsley on my dish? Or I don't like this. Or there's a way of eating in France that means that you kind of just eat everything. I mean, you might not like tripe. You might not like whatever. So you're not going to order those things. But everyone eats parsley. I mean, it's just one of those things. And you sort of learn to like it when you're growing up in France because, of course, children in France have a much more sort of diverse way of eating than, let's say, in the United States. That topic has been covered by books and, how French children have a much more diverse sort of diet than, for example, American children. And there is this thing where you just sort of eat it, the parsley thing. So there aren't as many people in restaurants saying, oh no, well, I don't like this. Can they substitute this or that or the other thing? People just kind of accept that the chef is right, that the chef is always right.
Absolutely. We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. So if we were to look then at this word gastronomy in English, and we look at this far more familiar to us word, but also derived from French, cuisine. If you were to look at the phrase French gastronomy versus French cuisine, are those words synonyms to you, or is there a big difference between them?
To me, gastronomy englobes or includes cuisine. That's just one element of gastronomy. As I mentioned before, really gastronomy is all about the art and knowledge involved in preparing and eating good food. I mean, that's, like the Cambridge Dictionary definition. And it really does mean all of these other things. So cuisine is specifically, dealing with what is actually going to be in your plate, the choice of a recipe, selection of the very best products, the preparation and the cooking techniques. All of those things are about cuisine. Cuisine, though, is the style of cooking. And then gastronomy is this whole other thing. I think it was Carême who was the sort of the person, the pastry chef who made pastries that looked like architectural works, works of art.
Absolutely. That was carême.
Okay. So when you think about French gastronomy, it's really like this. It involves so many different things. It could involve architecture. It involves all your senses, including, for example, if we talk about your sight, your eyes, you are looking at beautiful food on a plate, but you're also admiring the way the table is set and the types of glassware and flatware on the table. Maybe even the appearance of the other diners in the restaurant and at your table. I mean, a restaurant is almost like, it's like a theater. It is an art form. The whole idea of gastronomy, it's like, I'd like to compare it to a total art, what they call une œuvre totale. For example, like in Art Nouveau, there would be one sort of leading artist who would design, for example, a house. But every single thing in the house is designed in the Art Nouveau fashion. We've even got the hinges on the door, the doorknob. Every single thing in that house is in the same style as everything else. It's Art Nouveau, so it's a total work of art. I think that the French gastronomic restaurant is the exact same way. It's a total work of art. It encompasses so many different elements, which we've talked about, sort of wine, the choice of the recipes, the products, the glasses, every single thing that you see on the table, including what's in your plate, is gastronomy. And even the behavior, as I mentioned, of the people around the table, the other diners. It's almost like you're on a stage when you go into a gastronomic restaurant. The way you're dressed influences the atmosphere, the way other people are, the way, what they're drinking, the volume in the restaurant of the other diners, which is usually very, very hushed, very hushed atmosphere. It's this reverence for the French meal and everything that goes around that.
Yeah. And this is reminding me so much of, there was an evolution in France, which I'm sure that, I think we've spoken about this before. There was an evolution in France from service à la française, which was this service where you had all of your dishes, sweet and savory combined, sort of placed on the table all at once, and to service à la russe, which is the service that we associate with France now, which is called Russian style service in French, where you have a series of dishes from appetizer through the main, through the cheese and dessert, et cetera. And I remember reading that there were chefs who were very miffed, and I think carême might have been one of them, when the service à la française started to fall out of fashion, because part of the artistry of making a meal and serving a meal was in the way that you arranged the different dishes on the table. And they were worried that when you had sort of a series of dishes instead, that you would end up making the table naked and that you wouldn't have that artistry.
Well, that's funny that was their worry, because the table under sort of what we call Russian style service actually became so much more elaborate and so much about artistry, but more diversified, of different types of artists and different types of artisans who were creating all of the different things that could go on the table. I mean, at the very height of Russian style service, and you can't quote me on this, I don't know exactly what year, but let's say late 1800s, early 1900s, there were the table is actually so crowded with all of the sort of accoutrements and all of the accessories and dishes and glassware on the table that it was almost like the food became like secondary, which of course, that's not the case. But even nowadays, when you go into certain sort of very, I would say a little bit old fashioned gastronomic restaurants, you're still going to have probably 4 or 5 different glasses per diner on the table. I don't know how much flatware, but at least, you've got the flatware for the first course and the main course, and perhaps a soup spoon or specialized utensils. And then, of course, the flatware will be changed during the meal, and they'll bring new pieces of flatware out. And even, each diner under Russian style service had their individual salt cellar or salt well in front of them, which maybe we'll go back to that because of COVID. I don't know. And there was just so much stuff on the table, but it was actually an interesting time in French gastronomy because of all of the different artistry involved in laying the table with all of these different pieces. There was so much more, there were so many more specialized utensils that came about, and they were very, very decorative. It was almost like all of these different pieces that you would find on the table, it was just sort of a vehicle for a new design or something else that you could sort of draw on or inscribe or adorn, basically, including tablecloths, napkins, all the different things that you find in the table. It was just amazing. And you also had, of course, the democratization of, for example, silver-plated flatware, which came about through Christophe with their invention of a new and better silver plating technique, which basically brought all of these beautiful utensils to the masses. That was really interesting too. And it made all of that much more accessible, either to people at home or to different restaurants who weren't just serving nobles anymore. They were basically, able to serve more and more people from the time that the restaurant was invented up until now. And of course, nowadays you see, we're going back towards a simplification of the table.
Well, we definitely are, but there are a few places that are still sort of hearkening to this theater that's part of the French heritage of the culture of the table. And there's one place in particular that I absolutely love called Pantagruel, which opened right before the beginning of the lockdowns. It's Chef Jason Gouzy, and it's a phenomenal sort of modern gastronomic restaurant, which we're going to get into in just a second. But one thing that I love there is that he's sort of leaning into all of these bits and pieces of the theater of serving, which I know that you're working with at your current job, the sort of tableside flambeing, the bread service where you actually have a server coming to offer you different types of bread, or, serving things under a smoke-filled cloche, or the deboning of the sole meunière tableside. Like, these are all parts of the service that, it means that when I was a waitress and I was 19 years old, as a summer, it was my summer vacation and I was waiting tables to make a little bit of money. That's not the kind of server that we have in a gastronomic restaurant. These are career servers who have learned all of these bits and pieces of the theater that is the service, right?
Yes, definitely. People go to school to become servers, and it's not something that I was a server too in college and I loved it, but it never occurred to me to become a professional server or even that was even a thing. In France, it's definitely a thing, but you have so much knowledge to acquire, all of these different techniques of flambeing tableside, or, being able to take the fillets of any kind of flat fish, especially sole, for example. You're going to bone the sole in front of the customer, and you're going to be able to lift the fillets of sole perfectly off of the bone and put them right onto the plate, and very quickly. It's amazing how fast they do it, because of course it's going to get cold very fast, but they've done it so many times. All of those techniques. And even if you're going to a fine dining restaurant that doesn't have the tableside service, on the guéridon or flambeing, anything like that, they still have so much knowledge about even, setting the tables, about all of the different kinds of cheeses you could try if you've got a cheese trolley, which is a pretty typical characteristic of fine dining or gastronomic restaurants. I would say more so outside of Paris rather than in Paris, because they take up a lot of space, those huge cheese trolleys. But boy, are they a delight. I just love when they bring the cheese trolley out, and the server can actually just tell you about all the different cheeses on, what's on that trolley. And it's amazing how much training they go through. I think probably at least 2 or 3 years of training. I think there are 2-year programs for to become a server. It's amazing.
Yeah. I am also a huge fan of a cheese trolley. But even if you move away from the fine dining restaurants and you see there's a little bit of that theatrical pomp, even for like a cafe waiter who's going to open your Coca-Cola against his shoulder with one hand with his limonadier, and he'll be able to sort of thwack the cap off of your Coke. I'm not describing this very well, but come to Paris and I'll take you to a place where they thwack the cap off your Coke. And it's just phenomenal. It's great. I love it.
I love it too. It is very theatrical, and it does involve training, but it also implies a certain amount of pride that people have in their work and in doing things in a certain way. I think that's what's really important to me, is that everyone has their place in the French sort of gastronomic world. Whatever you've been trained to do, that's great. And you can always, learn other skills, but you always are going to take pride in what your skills actually are. And they are many, whether you're a server, a bartender, a chef, even an apprentice chef has skills, And so I think what sort of is different for me between the gastronomic restaurant, or really any restaurant, or even a cafe in France, as you mentioned, is this sort of pride that they're going to take in their work, and that they sort of infuse even the smallest gestures with this sort of flourish or a sense of pride. I think that's what's really, it's very worthy of our attention. And I think that it is very theatrical. And, when you go to the theater, you are watching people on the stage. And I think that there's a specific element of serving in France that is part of this theatrical kind of behavior, and that they like to be sort of recognized for that. I just love it. I just love that whole experience. It's just amazing. I mean, that's one of the main reasons I'm here in France and after all these years, because I really enjoy that, whether it's, as you mentioned, in a cafe or in a gastronomic restaurant.
Amazing. We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. And now we've been circling this idea for a while, so let's actually look at it head on. When I say gastronomic restaurant, fine dining restaurant, haute cuisine, are those synonyms? Is there a difference? How would you sort of, I don't know, couper la poire en deux? Or...
Il faut trancher, as we'd say.
You got to slice it.
Yeah, exactly. We have to slice it. Okay. Really, gastronomy to me encompasses those other words, as I mentioned with cuisine. Again, I sort of go back and forth between the fine dining definitions of fine dining and gastronomic restaurant. To me, fine dining is what we call a gastronomic restaurant in the United States. Mm-hmm. I think it's not the same notion as a gastronomic restaurant, because the gastronomic restaurant is specifically French to me. At least it comes from French ideas. I think you can go to a French restaurant in the United States and you're going to find that level of service, the level of attention to detail, which is really, really important, in all sort of hospitality industry, the attention to detail. I remember my head chef I worked in a Michelin star restaurant on an island in the Loire Valley for a couple of years. And I remember the head chef, he always said, soin, Allison, du soin, du soin, du soin. Meaning we're taking care. We're taking care of the customer. By taking care of this plate, by taking care of this fish, by taking care of every single step in what we do, we are taking great care with the products, with everything. And that is really the idea of sort of having this attention to detail, which I think in France is extremely developed, as you see it in the gastronomic restaurant. It's just an attention to every single detail, which I just think is amazing. And I think also there was something that I wanted to mention about gastronomy, which I think we can agree in a way that food is something that brings people together, no matter where you are in the entire world. But I like that Brillat-Savarin, of course, the author of Physiologie du goût, or Physiology of Taste, he really considered gastronomy specifically as a societal cement, because it doesn't just bring together families or different regions or even the entire country of France over food, but also about the specific sort of codes or rules around the consumption of food and around how food is served and around how all of the different details that go into making food and serving it. Because making and serving food seems so sort of reduced. And in reality, it's full of tiny, teeny little details, so many details. And I think anyone who's worked in a restaurant can attest to that, but especially a gastronomic restaurant. I think that gastronomy also is a societal cement in that it's something that everyone can talk about, and it's definitely something that everyone talks about in France. It brings together colleagues from all walks of life. I have to admit that there are two things that all people working together have in common and that they like to talk about in the French workplace. One of them is food, of course, because it's something that everyone, it's just a common factor for everybody. In France, whether you like this or not, the other subject is sex. And that's something that people talk about a lot in the French workplace, but that's another topic for another day.
But it's so true.
But, obviously a more controversial topic. But, obviously you always say in France and in many other cultures, there are two topics that you always stay away from, whether you're at a dinner party or at work or whatever, which is politics and religion. And I totally agree on that. So the food and sex thing, that always works, in whatever your environment you're in sort of the French workplace. But yeah, so I agree with Bria-Savarin and that idea that it's a societal cement. I really like that idea. So I guess to circle back around to your question, to me, gastronomy is about all of those things the other words that you mentioned. Fine dining. There was another one. It was cuisine, which we talked about. And
I was thinking haute cuisine as well.
Haute
like I wasn't
cuisine.
sure if there was a difference or if you perceive it, or if French people even say haute cuisine. I hear that a lot in English, but I don't hear it as much in French.
No, in fact, I think if you ask a French person, what does haute cuisine mean? I think there's a sort of a textbook definition, which in the United States, we would tend to see, for example, in the Culinary Institute of America or different sort of cookbooks you could find, specific definitions of like haute cuisine, cuisine bourgeoise, cuisine. There was another one. But I think if you would ask a French person, they'd be like, haute cuisine. I guess it means what's going to be on your plate in a fine dining restaurant, in a gastronomic restaurant, I suppose. But I think I know that there are very specific rules around what haute cuisine is and isn't. But it's a type of cooking. It's a type of usage of ingredients, kind of like nouvelle cuisine. It was a very specific way of preparing food with specific kinds of ingredients and a specific presentation on the plate, which doesn't encompass all of the other elements that gastronomy does. Again, I'll always go back to that idea of gastronomy as being une œuvre totale, a total art, which, that really covers it because it's about so much more than just what's in your plate.
And you did, of course, mention with your experience in the Loire that the M word, Michelin, which I think means a lot to French people, right? In the French press, you constantly hear like Michelin starred, or Michelin hopeful. But Michelin has been criticized a lot around the world for rewarding restaurants that fit into a certain, French gastronomy mindset. It took a very long time for restaurants that are outside of that sort of expectation of what we think of when we think of a Michelin starred restaurant, which is a de facto kind of French Western style restaurant, for other restaurants that are not in that mindset to kind of be rewarded. I don't know. Does gastronomic mean always like Michelin hopeful, Michelin, like, starry eyed restaurant? Are they always shooting for that star?
Those are all really pertinent questions. My experience in the Loire Valley was really interesting because I was already working at that particular restaurant when the star fell from the sky. And of course, I'd only been working there literally 3 weeks, so I would never attribute anything great that they had done to my help, of course. But it was really interesting because it really did just fall from the sky. The head chef and owner, he thought it was a joke. He thought it was a bad joke. Some people, sort of friends, vineyard owners that he's friends with, started calling him and be like, "Hey, we heard you got a Michelin star. Congratulations." And he was like, "What?" And so I don't know. He wasn't a Michelin hopeful. That was just out of his, he didn't, I don't think he even really necessarily wanted to be a part of that system, but you don't get to choose really unless you decide that. I know that certain chefs like Olivier Rollinger have sort of rejected the star or the second star or whatever, or even, drastically and radically close their restaurant to sort of get themselves rid of the star. It does come with a lot of pressure, it's a different kind of clientele. It was really interesting to actually see the evolution of this particular restaurant when I was working there, from just a sort of local, but, gastronomic. It was just, considered a very good address. It was actually funny because when I was looking for work, I had spoken with a family that we were sort of friends with or acquaintances in the area. and I was looking around for a gastronomic restaurant to go to work in or to apply to. And one of the guys in the family said, "Oh yeah, I've heard about this experimental restaurant down on the island, the Béoul, the island in the Loire." I was like, "Experimental? What does that mean?" Like right away, like I knew I had to go there because I was really curious to see what experimental meant. And after, I don't know how many months of working in this restaurant, I told the chef that, this is how I found your restaurant. He was like, "Experimental?" He was just like really outraged. He was like, "What does that mean? I'm making cooking fish the way it's supposed to be cooked, and that's called experimental." He was just really, it was just really, really funny. But yeah, so I got to see this evolution from the before the star and after the star, and the pressure that it put on all of us chefs in the kitchen, and the co-owner, the wife of the other co-owner, who started saying, "Okay, well, we've got to buy all these fancy dishes then, and go and buy more dishes and different dishes and all these things, for the dining room." And there was this whole discussion at the time, like, well, and I mean, this has been ongoing for years, that, well, Michelin, I mean, it's all about the kind of dishes and glassware you have in your restaurant anyway. It's not all about what's in your plate. And of course, Michelin keeps denying that that's true, that it really is about the food in the plate. But I don't entirely agree. And I think that it's unfair on Michelin's part, sort of a mauvaise foi, like they don't, like they're lying to themselves kind of thing by saying that it's really more, all about the food in the plate. Because if you're talking about a gastronomic destination and, the third Michelin star is literally like you are making a detour to go to that restaurant because it's your destination, it's a destination restaurant, then you are also going for all of the elements that I've mentioned of the gastronomic meal, which is going to be about also the decor, the flatware, the plates, the whole entire experience, not just the food. I mean, most people would say, yeah, we're going for the food, but it doesn't ring very true to me. I feel like it really is all about all of those things together. And that's what makes the French gastronomic meal such an amazing and an amazing work of art that is completely apart from every other dining experience that we know. And that is why it's on the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage and not every other type of meal in the world. It is really something very, very special and something to be revered. It's that hushed atmosphere that you find when you go into the restaurant. And, I mean, I've eaten with people, especially, my American clients and especially the American students who come over for study abroad. And when we go into a Michelin-starred restaurant, and mind you, this is only 1 star, they get into the restaurant and they're a little bit scared. They're a little bit like, "Oh, are we allowed to talk? What do we do when we sit at the table?" And it's, other clients, American clients, have likened it to like, it's like going to church on Sunday. And I said, well, I'm not a churchgoer myself, but if I did go to church, my church would look very, very much like a Michelin-starred restaurant. Like that is my church. But yeah, so it's, I don't know, the Michelin star is Michelin stars. It's a complex system. And I think things are becoming more simplified in the newer restaurants, especially in Paris, that are getting Michelin stars, but they don't have tablecloths. I mean, this is something we've talked about before, but, we're going toward a more simplified style of table. But you still do, as you mentioned, find tables that are, full of everything that encompasses art de la table, art of the table, which is a whole entire discipline in France, a whole entire field of study and practice. But it's a never-ending fascination for me anyway, of course.
Absolutely. And you did allude to this piece of the Michelin star system that I find fascinating, which is that the original rankings came about because the Michelin Tire Company made this dining guide where basically 1 star was a restaurant that was worth a stop, 2 stars was worth a detour, and 3 stars literally was worth a trip. So when you're saying a destination restaurant, you really mean it. It's like that's what the 3-star was shorthand for back in the day.
Exactly. And of course that used up your tires more because, that's what Michelin's goal was, to sell more tires, which, I mean, hey, it worked. But it's a the whole history of the Michelin guide is really fascinating, I think. But yeah.
Yeah. So I think we have a pretty good grasp on what gastronomic means. But then, of course, in 1992, we have the invention of this portmanteau word, which is written for the first time by journalist Sébastien Demorand. And he coins this word bistronomy, which now you see all over Paris. And it at its core originally described this rising trend of chefs who had these gastronomic or Michelin starred or both restaurants that were now going to turn their attention to bistros. And now we have this style of restaurant that I think probably, but you're going to do a much better job than I will, can best be described as sort of halfway between a bistro and a gastronomic restaurant. Is that kind of how you see these bistronomic restaurants that we have all over Paris now?
Yes, definitely. The idea really is that these chefs wanting to simplify the whole sort of aspect of the art of the table and all of that. The idea was that they would want to serve bistro dishes, like a little bit more homey fare, but that were created using the techniques of French cuisine, French gastronomy, meaning that there was a lot more precision cooking in all of the different ingredients, and the products themselves would be extremely fresh, the same kind of freshness and quality that you would find in a gastronomic restaurant, but being applied to sort of classic bistro dishes. So something a little bit more homey, like boeuf bourguignon, which you're not going to find in a gastronomic restaurant. That's just not part of what the gastronomic restaurant serves, unless it's completely destructured and completely reinvented in a very, very artistic way on the plate. But that's another discussion. So bistronomie, I would say, yes. And it does sort of take away all of the trappings of a classic gastronomic restaurant. Sometimes they're tablecloths, sometimes they're not, more often not. Glassware is greatly reduced. You don't have tons of silverware on the table. In fact, in between the first course and the main course, your server might even ask you to keep your fork and knife, and it would be the same one that you would use for the main course, which in a way, I definitely agree with, because it's much more ecological, and it really reflects, I think bistronomie really reflects sort of where we are today in terms of trying to sort of, reduce, reuse, recycle, sort of the old mantra, but also just sort of being a little bit less consumerist in terms of, how much water we're using to wash all these dishes and wash all these glasses. Also, to reduce maybe the number of employees that you have in your restaurant, because it costs a ton of money to hire people in France with all of the charge sociale. I mean, that's one of the big constraints to being a restaurant owner in France. It's extraordinarily expensive. So yeah, I definitely think we're going more in that direction, but there will always be gastronomic restaurants in France. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind, and there's a time and a place for those restaurants. So I like both kinds of restaurants, bistronomie. I love gastronomic restaurants, of course. It's all about, what occasion. It's much easier to sort of step out your door and say, hey, let's go to that restaurant. If it's like a restaurant, a bistronomy restaurant, rather than a gastronomic restaurant, where you're going to make a reservation, maybe weeks or months, many months in advance, depending on if it's, a destination restaurant. And part of the idea of going to the gastronomic restaurant or gastronomy is savoring. It's like you're looking forward to that experience for a really long time, ahead of time, and you're going to savor that whole sort of waiting period in between when you've reserved for the table and when you actually go, because it's a really big deal, I mean, people go to gastronomic restaurants if they have the budget, regularly, and maybe it's not as big of a deal for them. But I like to think that it is a special occasion. It's a really important experience as part of French culture.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. Thank you so much, Allison, for joining me today. I just have one last question before I let you go, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
It's probably the one that we just spent a very long time talking about. There are a couple of other words that I like that are just silly, funny words that just sound funny. I don't even know really in what situation I would use it. I think it's like saperlipopette. I think that's the word. Saperlipopette. I can't remember. I think it's just one of those like funny words. I'm going to have to.
Isn't it one of those things? It's like a not curse word. It's like something you can say like egads or something, like as an exclamation of like surprise or joy.
I think so.
Yeah.
Saperlipopette. It's very old fashioned.
I like it.
And yeah, like saperlipopette. I don't know. It's just silly. I don't know. It's
amazing.
Funny. Silly.
Allison, are you on any of the social medias? Are you on Instagram, Twitter? Where can folks find you?
Yes, I'm mostly on Instagram these days. So the handle is just Allison Zinder. And I love sharing photos of food, but all different kinds of experiences. In fact, I've just finished. I was just on a field trip to Marseille with my students, my first year students. So if I'm going to be sharing a couple pictures of that probably today or in the next couple of days, and then a whole sort of newsletter about that experience being in Marseille on a field trip with first year students, which was very funny. Anyway, so if people sign up for my newsletter, they can find out more about that experience and all kinds of different shenanigans, food related and otherwise, through my website. So that's AllisonZinder.com.
Amazing. And we'll throw those links into the description. So anyone who wants to hear more about all of Allison's gastronomic adventures certainly can. So thank you so much and have an awesome rest of your day.
Thank you, Emily. This has been a great joy. I always enjoy talking about food, and I enjoy talking to you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt!